Hi, I'm Owen from RAS Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the RAS Network. Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over. Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. I'm Pete Wargent. This is our weekly 2 cents segment where we take a plain English look at the big 3 property news stories of the week. And we're on a mission to become Australia's most trusted property podcast. So as usual, I'm joined by the maestro of mortgages, Chris Bates. Chris, how are we this fine day?
Pete, happy Sunday. I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. I'm actually down in Sydney this week. I've been driving down the coast, as you might remember, from a week or two ago. So I've been visiting a few of those lifestyle regions of Australia that got hectically busy over the past couple of years, but they do seem to have quietened down a little bit. So probably something we'll come on to talk about later on in the show. How's your week been?
Oh, it's been good. I had a good friend from London in town from when I used to live there over a decade ago. Had a nice big Mother's Day lunch with all the family. So, yeah, that's my week's been just friends and family. So let's get cracking into this week, Pete. I mean, what's the 3 stories we're going to attack?
That stuff always confuses me because UK Mothering Sunday is on a different day to US and Australia Mother's Day. So I always end up forgetting my mum's Mother's Day, and then we've got a different one over here, and then sometimes we're traveling. So the number of times that's got me into trouble is ridiculous. But anyway,
I'll send you a reminder next year.
Yeah, we went to Pancakes on the Rocks in Sydney, so no expense spared for Mum this week. So we're going to talk about the big 3 news stories of the week as usual. So firstly, we're going to do a bit more on the budget. So there's some big population numbers that came out in Labour's budget, and that's feeding into a lot of debate around the housing crisis and what might or might not be done about that over the next 5 years, given the huge population growth figures that are forecast in the small print there. Secondly, we're going to talk a bit about the narrative shift around inflation. So inflation is starting to come back down now, not just in the US, but actually all over the world. Lots of countries on the way back down from that big spike in inflation. So we're going to talk a bit about the narrative shift and what comes next. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about lending because I guess Chris is an expert in the area. So there's a few different policy shifts in the lending space that has a direct impact on the housing market. Chris, before we come on to that, I saw in the Sydney Morning Herald this week, I was actually down in the eastern suburbs yesterday, house 1920s bungalow up on the cliff tops there sold for $45 million. And then I saw at the weekend, there was a house in South Yarra in Melbourne that went $2 million over reserve, just a little detached house without parking, just a semi. And then, today, Kellyville, $3.5 million, a Homebush suburb record. And then even in Brisbane, I saw a house in Ascot that I was tracking sold for $5.9 million. So make it make sense for me, Chris. I thought we were supposed to be seeing a downturn, and these are suburb records all over the place. Is this just a stock shortage thing?
Yeah, I do worry about the auction results, right? I mean, that place in South Yarra, was it a great asset? I don't know, right? Like, I think there's that place in Tamarama, I mean, that's a dream block.
One of a kind, I suppose, yeah.
It's the reason money's not an issue for that chap. As a fund manager, I think, out of the US, an Aussie guy, putting $50 million on a piece of land that you can build your forever home in, that's a whole other sphere. I mean, a lot of the top end market, I think, is coming back. I think that, the fear around inflation, the fear around interest rates going through the roof is sort of subsiding. Ultimately, I do think that buyers have got a lifestyle need, a demographic need to purchase a home at some point. A lot of them are thinking, well, last year would have been a great year to buy, and now they're thinking, well, markets, CoreLogic have coming out with better results for the first quarter. Now they're thinking maybe I don't want to miss it, right? And so you can easily see that into the auction clearance rates where the desperation meter is starting to get quite high, right? People are willing to buy not just the great stuff, even the average stuff, I would say. And that's a real sign that there's a real heat behind the market. And so, low listings, but also buyers of urgency and buyers' willingness to sort of make the deal happen is much higher because they're worried they're going to miss it. They miss that opportunity and the market's going to run on them. And I think that almost that fear of missing out starting to come back, which is crazy because we're still in rates going up.
Yeah, hopefully people aren't overextending themselves. I think you're right. The very top end of the market, that's a luxury good, or what they call in economics a Veblen good. It's people buying assets that the average person can't, almost as a status symbol or a display of wealth. I mean, it's a bit like the same reason that the private schools in Sydney can charge 50 grand a year. I mean, is the level of instruction that much better? Probably not, but people will still pay it. And paradoxically, the higher the prices go, almost the higher the demand goes. It's not the usual laws of supply and demand, but it's those properties in places like Kellyville and Homebush and Ascot. Those are just. I saw another one in Rouse Hill today, sold for 2.8 million. These are sort of suburban houses that are selling at red hot prices, despite everything that's been going on with interest rates. So, obviously, a bit of a shortage of stock out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the worry is, I think overextending yourself is really hard at the moment, right? Because you can only borrow 5 times your income. It's not 7 or 8 times. And so usually the buyers who are in this market, they're cashed up. Maybe they've, sold assets or business or, inheritance, etc. And they're the ones in the market competing over a small number of properties on the market. And so, it's going to be interesting to see how the conversation around where interest rates go long term, because I don't think buyers right now are factoring in potential rate cuts. That's definitely not what our buyers are thinking. They're saying, I need to still protect myself if rates go up to 4 or 4.5%. They're not saying, I'm not worried about that anymore. Let's put in a rate at 4.5% because I know there's 1% of rate cuts coming in the next 6 to 12 months. If that happens, which will lead into our third story, that's obviously not great for prices, right? If you're looking to buy, it's obviously great if you own.
Not many forced sellers out there, so there's a real stock shortage, you're right. So let's crack on with the big 3 stories of the week. So I actually watched the budget from a caravan park somewhere on the East Coast around Lennox Head or Byron or somewhere. Pretty sad, I know, but I like to keep a track of what's going on. And this is kind of segued or parlayed into a debate about population. In the figures there, even if you went back a year ago, the budget figures were predicting overseas migration are just sort of coming back to normal for this financial year. And instead what's happened is we've got overseas migration of 400,000 for this financial year. But then even if you're going out across the forecast horizon, we're seeing higher overseas migration figures than we've ever seen before. So 315,000 for the 2024 financial year, and then staying high 25, 26, 27. So if you add all that up, plus the natural growth in the population, you're looking at well over 2 million people over 5 years. And this is at a time when there's major problems, as we've touched on before, in the construction sector. Builders and developers are struggling. So it looks like the coalition is taking the other side of this debate now. They're saying, well, this is too much. How are we going to cope with infrastructure, housing shortages? But don't forget, Labour is miles ahead in the polls, something like 58 to 42. Albanese's polling a lot better than Peter Dutton. So, I mean, effectively, Labour is going to be in power for those 5 years unless something dramatically changes. So this is going to have some real knock-on impacts to the housing market, Chris, because how are we going to supply enough housing for another couple of million people, or probably more than?
Yeah, ultimately, I think the big worry with growing our population is that what does that happen to our rental market, right? A lot of people think of what's happened to prices in property. I think what happens is the rental stress happens, right? And we've already got ridiculous rental stress. And what happens after people can't afford to rent? You get homelessness. So I think these are the real social issues that we're going to start to see. We're going to see rents keep going up because there's going to be more and more people moving here. Because, when you move here, you don't just buy a house straight away, right? You get to know an area, you get a job, you might be studying, and a lot of these people are, on 1 or 2 years sort of working visas, etc. So you're going to create even greater rental stress, and they're going to be people that fall through the cracks, and you're going to have issues with social housing, key worker housing, etc. Our cities start to become really undesirable places to live because you can't afford to rent, and you've got no key workers, etc. So I think it's going to become a real social issue over that 5 years. My worry is, though, that the Labor are going to go back to their old policies. And you can already start to see this in the SMH today, is that they're thinking about things about bringing the ban of negative gearing back. That's not going to also be great for a rental crisis. That's the opposite. Increasing the capital or reducing the capital gains tax discount would actually encourage less investors, would not be great for the rental market. And so these two policies, greater migration, which are going to create greater demand for rental accommodation. Yes, future buyers in the future, 3, 4, 5 years after they move here. But you're going to create more rental demand at a time where you're trying to penalise investors, which actually create rental stock. And you've got the issues with developers not being able to, and they're not building apartments generally for investors anyway right now, because investors find it really hard to borrow money just because borrowing capacity is really tight. And not many investors have actually got capacity left over, or they want to invest in the market, right? And so I think you got very few investors and very few developers able to build anywhere near the amount of housing that we need. And so it's not a pretty picture, Pete. I haven't got the answers, but it's not looking good on lots of different levels there.
So most new arrivals to Australia, you're right, are renters initially. Most people don't come here and buy a house on the first day they arrive. It's logistically just not realistic for most people. I did notice driving down the coast this week, though, that some of those lifestyle regions are noticeably quieter. Byron Bay, Lennox Head. I was in the Blue Mountains this week. And yes, there's a bit of tourism coming back from India and China, but it's not the hectic rental market that it was. And I saw this week SQM Research reported that rental vacancies are rising not only in those areas, but also Hobart has seen quite an increase, and Canberra. I think I did notice that the ABS reported that actually for April, there was something like 60,000 more people left the country than arrived, mainly on short-term journeys to Europe and elsewhere, so dusting off the passports. But that's really a short-term, sort of tweaking around the edges. The big long-term picture is even the budget forecast 2.2 million people in 5 years. So that's the equivalent of 5 Canberras worth of people, or the equivalent of a whole new Perth being added to Australia in 5 years. And that's the real challenge. So I think Labor's ideas of cutting back on negative gearing, increasing the capital gains tax discount. I think the problem is for private investors, you don't have to invest in residential housing. You could look at commercial property. You could go to put more money in your superannuation. You can invest in Aussie stocks, international stocks. You don't have to put money into housing. And if they make it less and less attractive for investors, that's just not going to help. I did notice in the budget, though, quite a move towards the build-to-rent sector, which you and Owen talked about on 2 Cents last week.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think the build-to-rent will be a small play over the next decade, and hopefully it's super successful and it offers a great rental solution for lots of different parts of the income spectrum, right? But I don't know if it's going to be the one solution. I do think, though, the investors are also the ones who potentially are selling right now. We've spoken about this on 2 Cents before, and if interest rates do stay high, and they do stay high for the next few years, it's not the homeowners going to be exiting the market, it's also the investors. So not many investors are going to be entering, but also investors will be leaving, which is then going to further exacerbate the rental stress in the market. And so I think that's a ticking time bomb that not many people are talking about right now. Because a lot of investors are holding on because they know if they do sell, they're not going to be able to go and buy another asset. So they can't say, well, if I sell this, I'll go and buy something better, because their borrowing capacity won't allow that. They've actually got more debt than they could borrow today. And so, the population story is going to heat up, and I reckon it's going to be a big conversation in the next election, which is, before you know it, it's only going to be 2 years away. Yeah,
short election cycles in Australia comes around before you know it. And yes, SQM definitely noticed or noted that people are moving back to the capital cities a bit now, which is driving some of those rental vacancy rises around the regional parts of Australia. So this is, as you said, this is not going away anytime soon. And population housing crisis debate will go on for the next couple of years and beyond. So let's take a look, Chris, at the second big story of the week. So the narrative around inflation. So in the US, in the middle of last year, we had inflation at 9%. This week, or just a week ago now, the inflation rate fell to 4.9% over the year. So it's still just gradually ticking back lower. I noticed, though, that the housing component, which has been a massive part of the inflation story in the US, is now finally rolling over. I think in real time, people have been saying, well, hey, rents are actually falling here, but it takes its time to work through into the official numbers. And now that's starting to pull inflation lower. Producer price inflation is already back to around 2%. So that sort of suggests further disinflation ahead. So what does that mean, I guess? Well, potentially the Fed has delivered its last interest rate hike in the US. Now, we're mainly interested in Australia, where we're sort of running a bit behind some of the other parts of the world because we kept the borders closed for longer. Lockdowns went on for a long time in Victoria. And yes, we've still got pressure on rents inflation, as you mentioned. But if you look at other parts of the economy, fuel prices, at least unleaded fuel prices, they're now down about 9% from a year ago. But I think, as you've mentioned once before, Chris, we're mostly on variable rate mortgages here in Australia. So all of those rate hikes are going to just suck the spending out of the economy. And Westpac has said on its credit card tracker, we're really looking at maybe a retail recession ahead or a consumer recession. So, Chris, so we always read the media and there's always something that's going to blow the world up. It was the fixed rate cliff. And then before that, it was the Banking Royal Commission. The inflation narrative is going to fall away, it looks like, over the next 3 to 6 months. So what do you think comes next? Are we going to be hearing news stories about recessions or per capita recessions? What do you think the new narrative will be?
Well, I think you're right. I think I saw that sort of Westpac report as well, and I think it makes sense, right? I think a lot of people were, still wanting to live the life in 2022, coming out of COVID and go on the holiday and enjoy their Christmas, and they're also on 2% mortgages. But ultimately, every month now, a big wave of people are coming off their mortgages. The banks are competing very fiercely to keep them a very good variable rate. They're actually offering them sensational rates to stay at the bank. So they're not jumping anywhere near as high as all the predictions were. A lot of the papers over the last year or so have been, people are going to come off 2% and go to 6%. That's just not the case. People are not going to 6% rates on their own. And so even if the RBA does go up a couple more times, it's still not going to be at 6%. So I think you're right. I think people are getting to this, coming off their fixed rates. They know rates are going to potentially go up. They also know that I think the confidence around jobs is nowhere near as high as it was. We've got lots of redundancies, I think, without pre-approvals, and people are wanting to see what happens with work and layoff before they purchase. But I think, definitely we're going into, batten down the hatches phase, which obviously leads into tough times for retail and things like that. And it really depends on how, what's the hit to our unemployment, right? And how tight does our labour market stay? If that stays really tight, maybe that's not great for inflation, right? Like it's, we could create this problem where we get wage price inflation as well.
The budget forecasts the unemployment rate to rise from around 3.5% where it is today to about 4.5% by 2025. So it's a gradual increase, but I mean, these are forecasts and they can often be wrong. We do have a lot of people coming into the country, which itself should hopefully solve some of those shortages. And wage price inflation, at least on the official figures, only running around 3.5%. So we're not there. Yeah, we certainly haven't seen the high increases in wages that some other parts of the world, notably the US, has seen. So what does this mean for property investors, Chris? I mean, I guess it feels like we're in the eye of the storm at the moment, but if you look at what financial markets are saying, potentially lower interest rates over the next 18 months. So it's largely a case of hang in there and try to, a bit like the old theme of invest for how you think the world will be in 2 years' time rather than how it is today. Maybe try not to get too caught up in the weekly or monthly headlines because I guess there's always catastrophe being forecast and predicted, but most often the most extreme predictions don't come to pass.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think 6 months ago, everyone was very concerned around inflation. But then if you look at where we are today, the stats you're saying there in the US, I know the UK is also, energy prices have collapsed over there. That was causing huge problems, right? And so I think, you'd have to say the inflation story is turning over, right? Maybe it's not going to go down as fast as people expect, and maybe rates are going to have to go higher in the short term. But I guess you've got to make a call on that. You can be very doomsday and say that inflation is going to be super high and rates are going to be super high for the next decade, or you could say that this is going to be nipped in the bud in the next 2 or 3 years. And is the RBA going to be able to hold rates at 4%, or are they going to have to cut them to stimulate the economy out of some type of recession, or and to stimulate the wealth effect? And so if you take that view, ultimately, as soon as you get to a situation where inflation gets under control and they start talking about rate cuts, I think you've missed the boat. I think you'll start to see all your competition will start factoring in rate cuts to what amount of debt they're willing to take on, and they'll start stretching because they're not concerned around rates going up. They're actually factoring rates going down. And that's definitely not the case right now, but it could very easily be the case in 6 months' time. And I think this leads into our third sort of story, Pete, around lending policy shifts and what may happen around things like APRA and the banks.
Absolutely. So this is more your bailiwick than mine, but I did see Westpac reported in its consumer sentiment figures this week. Consumer sentiment took a knock because of the interest rate hike, but actually house price expectations have absolutely rocketed back since around October last year, which is more or less what you were talking about previously, was that was really the peak of the fear. Now people are starting to think, well, maybe we're close to the peak of the cycle. The world hasn't ended. And, the prices are actually rising in a lot of markets, which is just, people, I guess, bit of a Pavlovian response. We've always seen downturns followed by upswings, and people are just piling back in. Now, on the lending side of things, Chris, a few of the banks have reported strong profits over the past week or two. Mortgage arrears are rising, but not really that much so far. There might be a bit more in the post. But it does seem that maybe the banks are pulling back from some of the mortgage wars narrative that we have been seeing over the past 6 months or so. Is that what you're seeing as a broker?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ANZ a few years ago thought it was a great idea to offer people with home loans a cashback if they wanted to switch to ANZ. I guess, initiative was extremely successful for ANZ. So it was like, if you refinance to us, we'll give you $4,000. I'm not sure if it's 4 or 2. And we'll give you a lower rate. ANZ got flooded with new business. Every bank thought, hang on a sec, this is a great idea. Why don't we do a cashback? And then all of a sudden, since then, I don't know if it's been 2 or 3 years, all the banks have been offering cashback. Sometimes $2,000 to $6,000 to $8,000. It's been crazy. It's like, if they want to get a refinance, you've got to offer a cashback. I think all the banks, probably secretly behind the scenes, I'm sure there's a little cartel happening where they've all said, look, let's just get out of this cashback game. We're all shooting ourselves. We're all cannibalizing ourselves. And finally, they've all one by one said we're not going to offer cashbacks. So they've all sort of towed the line. And I think I wasn't sure it was CBA pulled out first, but now everyone else is. So I think the cashbacks aren't really going to exist, which I think is actually good. I think it was encouraging people just to play the game, get the cashback, refinance, and with churning the banks really was really unprofitable business for the banks, and it wasn't really great for their mortgage books. But also, interesting thing, one of the banks, I don't like to say who, also upped their pricings out of cycle rate increase this week on their existing book. And I think what's happening is the banks have been so competitive on pricing that they're now saying, hang on a sec, I think we've gone too far. I think we're going to increase the cost on our mortgage book because we've gone too big on the discounts. But what this actually means is if you've got a home loan and you haven't renegotiated it, you're actually just paying even more loyalty tax if you haven't refinanced, because the banks are now going to up their rates on existing customers, I feel, over the next 6 months. So I think you've really got to track your rate because, not many people would have picked that up. They would have just thought it was an RBA rate increase, but it wasn't. It was just an out-of-cycle increase by the banks. And so I think there's also lots of innovation happening, or whether you call it that, with the banks around refinancing. I think APRA is really going to allow the banks, ANZ, for example, and some other banks, you can refinance without having to do a full serviceability assessment, as long as your new repayments under what you're currently paying. I think that's really good because it stops people in this fixed rate cliff and, stuck on a really high rate. So I think it's a really competitive, thing for the mortgage market. But also I think, the big story is going to be around borrowing capacity. And APRA have increased the serviceability buffer from 2.5% to 3%. I think they did that at the height of 2021 to really slow down the market because they, to protect borrowers if rates went up. They were really late to the party, to be honest. They came in after prices had already gone up 30 to 40% to say, hang on a sec, let's protect borrowers from now on at 3%. Well, the market, the horses have already bolted. But if APRA come in to encourage more lending and reduce their serviceability buffer, it would make sense, I believe, to do that when rates have been stable for some time and rate cuts are starting to happen. And So if you get to this situation where rate cuts are happening and APRA step in to reduce serviceability buffers, you're going to get a double hit to borrowing capacities. Rates go down, borrowing capacities go up, but also APRA steps in, reduces the serviceability buffer, borrowing capacity goes up, plus you've got wage increases, more self-employed business profits, etc. So you're going to see capacities going up, and then people's desire to take on that debt also go up because rates are going down and the market's also been going up. So I think that's the sort of the medium term view is if we get to this position where rates are going plateau and then maybe there's rate cuts, I also think that's when borrowing capacities are really going to start shooting up again.
Phew, there's a bit to digest there. So yes, I'm glad to see the back of cashbacks. I always have this sense that somebody's paying for that. If it's probably the existing borrowers, they're paying a higher price effectively, or a loyalty tax, while the new borrowers are getting these sort of cashbacks.
Yeah.
And I think in the end, it comes out in the wash and somebody's paying for it. I saw this week that one of the non-bank lenders reduced its lending assessment buffer down to 200 basis points. So if you're not familiar, that's when you're going for a mortgage, you'll be stress tested with a buffer to ensure that you can comfortably make the repayments in the event of interest rates going up. But we've had the biggest lending assessment buffer on record since 2021, as Chris was saying. Now, most of the banks are actually regulated by the prudential regulator APRA, and they're still at 300 basis points. But I have heard around the traps, Chris, that for refinancing existing mortgages, potentially there could be some leeway there. I think it's already happening, as you mentioned. So the fixed rate cliff, it might still bite for some borrowers, but they should be able to shop around a bit more wriggle room and an ability to refinance just to smooth out that shock factor, I guess, as people reset their mortgages to higher rates.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've really got to stay on your home loan. It makes sense for me to say that as well, right? Being a broker. But I think right now, because the loyalty tax is so big, because most people's repayments are jumping all over the place, coming off fixed rates, and, that also might be, making things quite tough from a financial point of view. And because borrowing capacity is really tight, and because there's these new sort of policies that didn't exist before that allow you to refinance, where you don't think you can refinance, maybe you can. And so things are changing. We've heard through, state managers at the banks that probably shouldn't tell us things, but the banks are doing things as well, right? Because they know about this issue. They know that, people are struggling on their home loans, and they'd rather keep them in their homes on a lower repayment than, start to create issues with arrears and things like that. So the non-bank story is a bit of a worry. We do well under 5% of our loans at non-bank. It's probably more likely under 3 or 1%. And, reason is a lot of people who've gone to non-banks traditionally are people who are stretching their borrowing capacities to the absolute limit. And usually it's to buy one more investment property, or maybe it's low doc loans or issues with their credit file. They might be the other ones. But those type of investors are also most likely to be the ones to go into arrears, right? And so I think you're getting issues with their funding and also their arrears rate and non-banks. And that's one of the big challenges with the non-banks at the moment. They're not having access to cheap cash and can lend it out really easily because there's lots of investors wanting to stretch.
Mortgage arrears definitely rising for the non-bank lenders. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. So let's wrap this up then, Chris. So the big three news stories, I think the population and the big Australia debate and what the government decides to do about that. Well, that's not going away anytime soon. We had 2.25 million or possibly even more people in 5 years. That's going to be a huge issue, an election issue. And there'll be potentially new policies taken to the next election. So watch this space. I think the inflation narrative is starting to shift. Not quite yet in Australia, but it certainly is in other parts of the world. So I think towards the end of the year, we'll see the media headlines shifting away from inflation and towards the risk of potentially a downturn, a slowdown, or maybe a recession. Remember, though, that not all recessions are 1933 and or 2007 to 2009. Sometimes you just get a small recession, or maybe what they call a per capita recession, where after you adjust for the population, the economy goes backwards. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's a doomsday scenario. And I think on the lending policy as well, it's a movable feast. So I think definitely stay in contact with your brochure, with your broker, I should say. So, Chris, on that point, I noticed a rebranding for you at Blusk now. So where can people go, as you're a doyen of answering all the mortgage questions, where can people go if they want to find out some more?
Definitely go into the show notes. There's a link there that Owen and I have put together. And if you aren't already, get on Pete's blog. I read it religiously every day, and I think it's an amazing resource of learning. So awesome to chat this week, Pete, and I look forward to chatting next week. And everyone have a happy Sunday.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'll be traveling this week. I'm doing some long haul flights, so I'll have to tap out a few blogs. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. We do always encourage you to send in your property questions via the link in the show notes, or even if you just want to say good day. And really enjoyed it. Thanks, Chris. And we'll see you next episode.
We'll see you then.